So my story today is about luck, and I feel some people are born lucky, and I also feel that you can invent your own luck. But this story, the main character who I'm really drawn to was definitely born lucky. Okay, so I'm going to give you the landscape where there's rolling hills and there's a small cottage not far from a palace. And inside there's a very poor lady. And, you know, she was a very humble lady. Yet she gave birth to a son, and suddenly her luck completely changed. And she took him out. He was a beautiful boy, and she took him out into the town, and a wise woman from the town came up to her, and she stared at the boy quite intently, really observing him, and she said, "Do you realise you have an incredibly lucky boy here? He has a mark on his forehead. Now that is a sign of luck. And what's more is he will grow into a man, and he will marry the king's daughter." This woman thought, wow, my son, I only live in a cottage, like, that's incredible. And she didn't really think any more of it. But news got round, as they do in small towns, and it wasn't long before this horrible king who ran the palace had heard of this news. And immediately he said, "There is no way that my daughter is ever going to marry a common boy." And so he thought up this incredibly evil scheme where he would go over to the cottage, and he disguised himself as a nobleman. So he went to the cottage. Hello, lovely son you've got here, yes, what? I'd very much like to bring him up as a lord, considering he is a very beautiful, charming young boy. And the woman said, "No, there is no chance you're going to have my son." And unfortunately, due to them living in very poor conditions, he gave them money, and she finally gave in. We've all been there, we've all been there. So he took the boy and put him in a box and nailed this coffin. Right, there's it. I've bloody got him down. Threw him into the deepest part of the river and thought, that's it, done with him. He's gone. Bye-bye. And just walked off. And luckily, this boy was a boy of luck. So that box/coffin, if you want to put it in a negative way, floated down the river. And luckily, the miller's apprentice was sat at the side of the river, and he thought, "Oh, my luck is in, it's going to be treasure. It's got to be treasure. You know, look at that, it's a box." Reeled it in, opened it, and this boy just started going, "Ah! Ah!" So he thought, oh, okay. Took him back to the miller's where he was working, and the miller and his wife, unfortunately, couldn't have children. So they said, "This is fantastic. Look, we've been blessed with a beautiful baby boy." And they brought him up as their own, and as he'd grown twice as tall as the miller was strong, the king comes along the road, and just by chance happens to want to stay at the mill. And he said, "This is a very interesting boy you've got here." Yeah. And they said, "Well, funnily enough, we found him floating down the river one day." And he went, "Oh, what?" "No, it was in a box, it was nailed." "Oh, really? Yeah." It was like more awkward at this point. And he said, yeah. Well, anyway, we brought him up as our own child. And the king said, "Oh, brilliant! Well, I've got a position for him. In fact, I need a letter sending to the Queen. I'm just going to write it now." "Yeah, there it is." And he gave it to them. And he said, "Here's some gold, you know, send the boy off." And he sent the boy with this letter. And by this time, he was further away from the palace. So he was walking, and he'd walked long into the night. At this point, it was pitch black. And he came up to a cottage. And there was a woman who opened the door. "What do you want? Now you can't stay here." And this boy was just really lovely. So she said, "Oh, come on then, but you can have a rest, then you've got to go, because my son is in charge of a vicious gang of robbers, and he will do you in the night. Sorry to say it. I'm not scared of robbers. Robbers, and his name was now Hans, the miller and his wife decided to call him, and he just fell asleep, and the robbers and his lot come back, and he said, well, who's that? And he said, oh, don't touch him, he's a really nice boy. And he went over to kick him and stopped, and he said, bloody hell, there's a letter for the Queen here. Picked it up, opened it, and it said, whoever gives this letter to you must be killed instantly. That's pretty harsh, gotta say. And, well, this robber thought it was hilarious, so he said, right, wait for this. Wrote a letter himself, gave it to the boy. In the morning, the boy goes to the palace, walks up to the king, not the king, sorry, the king's away, the Queen, and said, here is a letter from the king. She opened it and said, oh, my boy, and kissed him and said, you must immediately marry our daughter. So the king comes back and says, oh, no, what's this? And he notices the boy. He said, I did not write that. I did not. If he is going to marry her, obviously we need to send him on a quest. So he said, there's a cabin 300 miles from here, big, giant, plucks 3 hairs, bring them back. And the boy goes out and does this. Well, he starts out, and what he doesn't know is that the giant is awful, and also it's a huge task just getting there. So he starts walking day and night, comes up to a gate, and the gatesman says, what are you doing here? And he said, well, I know a lot of things, I know everything. And the man says, well, at the moment we've got a hole in the ground that used to spurt out amazing wine, but now it's dry. So he said, well, on the way back, I'll tell you, if you let me through the gates, that's fine. Walks through, and then the next thing he comes up to a watchtower, and the watchman says, you can't pass here, mate. And he says, oh, but I know everything. And he says, well, there is a tree that used to bear golden, gorgeous, delicious apples, and now no more, the tree is bare. And he said, well, I'll tell you on the way back. And he was like, right, fine, okay, let him through. Comes up to a huge, enormous river, and there's a ferryman, and he says, well, can I get on the ferry? And the ferryman says, no. And he says, okay, well, I know everything, so is there anything you need to know? And the ferryman says, yes, I need to know one thing. Why do I row backwards and forwards, yet never get off the boat? And he said, well, I do know this, but I will tell you on the way back. So he finds the cave with the giant. He walks in, ready, right, I can take on a giant, and he sees a little measly old lady sat there, and she goes, hi, love. And he says, hi, I've come to come and get hairs from the giant. So he explains what he wants to find out from the 3 people, and he also explains he needs 3 hairs. So she says, that's fine. In the night, I'll ask him these questions, and I'll get the hairs for you. But meanwhile, I'll turn you into an ant. So he finds out during the night, because she plucks the first hair and wakes the giant up once he's come home, and he says, well, that's stupid, isn't it? And he just knows all of the answers to these questions. So then, in the morning, she turns him back into a human once the giant has left. Sends him on the way. At the first stop is the ferryman, so he gets on and he says, I'll tell you once you've rowed me to the other side. And he says, fine. He said, right, all you've got to do is wait for the next person to come along and pass them your oars, and off you go. You're a free man. He said, brilliant. Came to the next town and he said, right, your tree that you're having a problem with, there's a tiny little mouse that comes and gnaws at the roots. If you get rid of the mouse, there's no problem. So they did, and all of a sudden the fruit started coming back, these beautiful golden apples, and they were so happy they gave him 2 donkeys laden with huge bags of gold. Comes to the next town, and he says, well, you know the hole in the ground that used to spit amazing wine? There's just a big toad stuck down it. All you need to do is get your hand down there, lift it out, voila! And he said, right, and they were so pleased as well when they saw the red wine spurting. They were all really happy. Again, 2 donkeys, loads more gold, which is fantastic. And then he gets back to the palace and he says to the king, right, now I can marry your daughter and I can make a palace twice the size of this. And the king is a very awful, greedy man, and he says, this is interesting. Where did you find the gold? He said, well, actually, if you go to a ferryman across the wide river, he'll take you over the other side, and there is loads of gold. You can take all the gold that you want. And to this day, the king hasn't been seen, because obviously he's gone over. Yet, Hans married the princess, and due to the king being away, he then became king. Yet it's said to this day, if you see a man rowing backwards and forwards on a lake wearing a crown, that's the king. Thank you.